I want to talk a little bit about Oroonoko and where we left off the other day. The novel can be it is not segmented into chapters or anything like that, and it's honestly a little short to call a novel. But you can see two distinct phases, at least two distinct phases, where in the first half it is set in Africa, and it is a kind of a courtly drama, a romance, and it has an awful lot to say, as we found, about the role of women and the portrayal of women, and you can see Aphra Behn sort of nudging at some cliched notions of passive women, weak-willed women, and particularly also, notably, I would say, how older women should all just, they're completely inconsequential. They're barely human beings. And she is undermining that in a lot of very subtle ways. And so the first half of the narrative can be seen as a critique of society and a subtle suggestion that, well, maybe we could do things a little bit better. Maybe if we just consider all of these received ideas, these traditional notions, these habitual perspectives that have come down to us through the ages about gender and patriarchy and power and sexuality and all of that stuff. If we just think about those a little bit, maybe we can get to a better place. Maybe we can correct some of the imperfections in our society, some of the injustices in our society, and make a more perfect society. In the second half of the book, the locale switches, and the concerns with gender and aristocracy that are so bound up and so prominent in the first half kind of get subsumed. They're still there, very much so still there, but they drop into a lower register, and the prominence of the question of slavery crops up because Oroonoko is captured as a slave. Remember, the title of this is the subtitle of this book is A Royal Slave, and the beginning of the narrative, you have the narrator. Here we can just call that narrator the author, Aphra Behn, makes an explicit case for this is going to be about slavery. This is about slavery in the New World, so to speak, as well. And so really leaning on that hard. And then that just kind of goes away for a little while. But then at one point, the novel takes a very sudden turn. After a glorious military victory, a great battle, led by Oroonoko, he comes back and is hailed as a hero, and you get this short 2 paragraphs that hinge the narrative from one thing to another very abruptly. Oroonoko was no sooner returned from this last conquest and received at court with all the joy and magnificence that could be expressed to a young victor, who was not only returned triumphant, but beloved like a deity, when there arrived in the port an English ship. This person had often before been in those countries and was well known to Oroonoko, with whom he had trafficked for slaves and had used to do the same with his predecessors. So it is a kind of a clunky transition when all of a sudden things turn because an English ship comes to town. It's got kind of a Western feel, honestly, an old Western movie when, you know, the bad guy comes riding into town. Here, it's an English ship, and everybody in this context, reading this or witnessing this, let's say, would know what an English ship could mean. It is, well, colonization, but more explicitly in this case, slavery. The English ships come for really one purpose, and that is to gather up slaves to take to the New World as part of the triangle trade that we looked at last time. So that's a little jerky, but at the same time, you could say that Aphra Behn, the great dramatist, also knows how to make things exciting, make things feel like they're moving, and that is often with contrast. The great glorious victory is suddenly turned on this event that portends doom for the hero. So there's that sudden Prozac-inducing turnaround. But also note that other line. This person, the captain of that ship, had often before been in these countries and was very well known to Oroonoko, with whom he had trafficked for slaves. So the author, Aphra Behn, is having the narrator, sort of Aphra Behn, basically implicate Oroonoko in this slave trade. So in this moment where it is like very heightened drama, there is this point that is very explicitly made that Oroonoko is involved in this. It's not clean hands, so to speak. He is complicit, perhaps, because he has himself trafficked in slaves in the past. The story has made that point already, that these tribes, these kingdoms, are used to fighting with one another, capturing prisoners of war, and using those prisoners of war as slaves themselves, or selling them to slave traders for money. This is a very wealthy society, and this is one of the reasons that it is so wealthy, that it is trading with rival tribes, or trading rival tribesmen as prisoners of war into slavery. So there is this automatic sort of complicated relationship with this. You could say, and many critics do, that, well, she is bringing up a very dramatic and censorious and negative portrayal. When the English ship comes into harbor, it is a bad thing. It is a very negative thing. So you could say that, well, okay, so here the story, independent of what the author wants, here the story is making an argument that slavery is bad. Because with that image of the English ship, and I love the italics in that, you can almost hear like the Darth Vader theme, dun 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 dun. You know, it's funny. The English ship comes in, and it is clearly coded as portentous, as dangerous, as evil, lurking in. You can make that argument that she is pointing out, the narrator, the author, whomever you really want, the text is saying that slavery is bad. But in that very next sentence, that very next paragraph, seems to be qualifying that and saying, yeah, but the badness exists on all sides. Oroonoko himself is bad. Oroonoko as a stand-in, as a symbol for the aristocracy of the African tribes, is bad. He is involved with this. So is it a moral judgment? I'm not sure. You can say that by pointing out the injustice of slavery by just highlighting it in so dramatic a fashion. And it gets very dramatic very soon. Aphra Behn is, as an author, certainly the narrator is calling attention to a great evil that needs to be addressed so that we can have a more just society. Yeah, you can say that. But is she backtracking with, this person had often been before to these countries and was very well known to Oroonoko, with whom he had trafficked for slaves? Does that change the character of slavery? Does that change the nature of guilt? Does that imply that, well, everybody does it? The paradox of art is that it presents us with a vision that we are then obligated to react to. And if it's just telling us what to believe, it's not really art, it's propaganda. But by involving us in the process, by telling your readers, okay, you got to do some of this for me, you got to lean in and start to piece it together, I can only go so much. That's when the possibilities of art really tend to metastasize, really tend to explode and become so much more powerful. So much so that I would say the text kind of gets away from her, from Aphra Behn. I don't like leaning on the idea of authorial intention. What did the original author mean? And, that's got to be the end point. Well, this author meant this, and then that's all we can say about it. No. We as readers can take what we are presented with and move beyond the author. Very often the author is hampered by other conditions that we are not, so why anchor ourselves to that one person? But in this, she seems to be saying, consider the institution and tradition of slavery carefully and think about whether it is genuinely beneficial. Just like in the first half of the book, she seemed to be saying the same things about patriarchy and gender distinctions and gender roles. She seems to be saying the same thing here about slavery, that we should think critically about the traditions that we are presented with before we just perpetuate them out of habit. But the problem with this book is it's hard to limit it to slavery once you take on that role of interpreting it as you will. Because slavery is inherently about a hierarchy in society. And the slave-master hierarchy is fairly analogous and easy to see a parallel in the monarchy, where a social hierarchy is just as rigid, just as inherited. And she, as a arch monarchist, a supporter of the king and of the aristocratic tradition, seems to be at war with herself in certain moments of this text, or at least the text is at war with itself. I will give her the credit for writing this into the text and designing it so that there is no clear answer on one way or the other. Hierarchical arrangement in society where some people are powerful and some people are not is implicit throughout this book. And once you understand that, okay, it could be about slavery, but it could also be about this other thing. And once we make that leap, we can make another leap to the king. The mind will go in those directions. And that's what enlightenment is. It's about opening up those opportunities for the mind to question. That's what she says at the beginning. But every now and then also she pops up and acts as a character. And in the section, in the second half of the book, we get this section where the narrator explains who she is in more detail. And she is supposedly the daughter of a colonial official who has been transported to Suriname and given a lavish estate, the nicest house on the block, and he brought his young daughter along, and she is, a perfectly lovely young lady who just meets, or first she hears about, and then she goes and she meets the character of Oroonoko, and they hit it off, and then she starts having him into afternoon tea and stuff or whatever, and they start talking, and the relationship is kind of curious at that point, because then, yeah, she is giving a demonstration that she is an eyewitness to at least these portions of the story. And in those meetings, she is theoretically getting Oroonoko's version of events before that part of the story. But it's a very uncertain relationship. She is trying to demonstrate that what she is conveying is a kind of objective truth. But this narrator is also what we would call an unreliable narrator, because she admits that her perspective is more complicated than just telling us just the facts. She has a meeting with him. They have a long conversation. Caesar, as he is now known, Oroonoko, has been renamed Caesar. We can go on about the whitewashing or the renaming of characters. But Caesar is now starting to grumble after having a fairly light load as a slave, where he was said to be, quote, a slave in name only. Separate quarters, better food, better treatment. He was not one of the ordinary ones. He was treated as a prince among the slave population. But after he has started to grumble about his position, his enslavement, and starting to get the sense that all the promises that have been made to him that he will be freed, he's starting to doubt the honesty of the slave traders. He's starting to doubt that he's ever going to be freed. Are they just lying to get me to shut up? And this frustration starts to come out in his conversation with the narrator, who then admits, "Before I parted that day with him, I got, with much ado, a promise from him to rest yet a little longer with patience, and wait the coming of the Lord Governor, who is every day expected on our shore. He assured me he would, and this promise he desired me to know was given in perfect complaisance to me, in whom he had entire confidence. After this, I never thought it convenient to trust him much out of our view, nor did the country who feared him. But with one accord it was advised to treat him fairly, and oblige him to remain within such a compass, and that he should be permitted, as seldom as could be, to go up to the plantation of the negroes, or, if he did, to be accompanied by some that should be rather in appearance attendants than spies." This is right after he has just been spilling his heart out, let's say, about his feelings of resentment and betrayal, and really opening up his soul to her as a friend. And then the minute he walks out the door, she's immediately thinking, we have to keep an eye on him. Is she really a friend? She is very curious about the world around her, and she wants to look past all of the the negative stuff about racial stereotypes and all of that. And oh, I'll just have in Oroonoko seems like such an extraordinary human being, a beautiful leader, and just so heroic. And I'd like to sit down with him and talk for a little while. And when they do, she learns so much about him, and he seems so cultured and sophisticated, and speaks English and French and all this stuff because he's been so educated in European ways. But that in itself is a problem of sorts, because she is responding to Oroonoko as exceptional. He is not just another slave. She's not presumably inviting in just, any old guy who is out there in the field and saying, "Hey, you, yeah, come on up here. Let's have some tea and cucumber sandwiches, and you can tell me your particular tale of woe in the world, or let's go. What do you think about this artist or this writer or this philosophical idea?" And we'll just have a nice little heart-to-heart, tete-a-tete. She doesn't. She just singles out the one guy who is extraordinary in every degree. And here you got to look at the story as a whole, because Oroonoko is from the very beginning singled out as special. He is a natural monarch, a king through and through. He is the best looking, he is the smartest, he's the bravest, the most heroic. He is everything that a human being can be. But that gets complicated when he is just lumped in with other Africans because of the color of his skin. Is he exceptional, or is he a representative? Is he the one man among many, or the only man risen above the many? This story doesn't seem so certain. The complications that get involved in this story are all over the place, quite frankly. Aphra Behn seems to be trying to pick and choose among what readers can think about and decide for themselves about, and those things that they should not think about and decide for themselves about because they're not really capable of doing so. So she might be trying to suggest that, well, slavery is wrong, but slavery is based on a master-servant hierarchy, and, well, how is monarchy not a master-servant hierarchy? So there's one iteration of a inherited tradition that has a long history in civilization, and that we should cast a critical eye on and dispel to build a more perfect world. That's bad, but monarchy's good. How do you resolve that? Now, you could say, as she kind of does, that I'm just presenting this and it's for you, the individual reader, to put it together in your own rights, but I don't know. The problems that come up once you start picking apart tradition, once you start casting a critical eye and thinking, all right, let's think about this. That's a bad idea. What all those people for so many years did, it's just terrible. It's a bad idea. So we're going to rethink it and get rid of that. But you can't cauterize that imagination. The value of art is that it sparks an idea, it sparks an initiative that the human mind can then take and pursue as it will. There is no limitation on it. And the issues with this story that come up are remarkably convoluted, as is the morality of hierarchy in general. The story itself is all fairly conventional. Just like in the beginning, I was saying the story is kind of a retelling of the King Arthur and Lancelot and Guinevere story. Here, the end of it, the second half of it, is a fairly conventional story. It is original for its time in being, in giving details, historical details about the condition of slavery, about the patterns that are evolving out of the triangle trade, and you can't discount that, because this is one of the first popular portrayals of the horrors of that life to reach a European audience. So there's that. Give her credit for that. But at the same time, the story itself is fairly conventional in that he gets mistreated, he rises up in rebellion, because he is such a charismatic leader, such an exceptional human being, he just goes to the other slaves and says, you should join me in this rebellion, and here's why. And because he is so brilliant and such a charismatic leader, he gets them to agree. But the story itself is that he tries to launch a rebellion, he gets killed, and things go on as usual. It's not all that interesting. And it has some significant analogs where you see him at the end getting tortured, and yet he very heroically endures the torture. And that wonderful little detail, while it's being very disgusting, and they're talking about cutting off his legs and cutting off his genitals and cutting off his arms, they include the little detail that, well, he had started to smoke a pipe and he had somebody put a pipe in his mouth, so that as they were mutilating him while alive, he could sit there and smoke a pipe so nonchalantly. And that just seems so cool. It sticks in the mind. It's very memorable. But that basic pose of being tortured and killed while not letting it affect you, while focusing on something larger and more divine, well, that has a very clear precedent as well, and that is, dare I say it, Christ. The story at the end is the story of Christ. He is a leader who gets together a rebellion of sorts and then is punished for them. And he is mutilated and tortured, but his example lives on. And it is the example that is heralded at the end of the story, just like the example of Christ is basically exploded into Christianity and gets beyond the individual character of that one figure. So it's a fair, just like the beginning is about King Arthur, essentially, in the royal court, the ending on the plantation is essentially the story of Christ. That's all fairly conventional. You don't have to come up with original plots. The originality wasn't really a thing yet. But what's interesting in that is to see the little grace notes that get put in, all the little details that come out besides that plot. One of those grace notes, one of those details is the actual portrait of the historical reality of slavery in the New World at that time. I'd say that's very significant. And she wanted to find a story where she could frame it with that. People aren't going to just say, I'm going to go on a long diatribe about the evils of slavery. No one would buy that. She's a professional writer. She's got to sell books. She knows nobody's going to buy that. So she's going to tell this story of a hero and then slip in the stuff about the historical consequences and the historical context. And that's one way of delivering it. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. The other little details are significant as well. Consider Imoinda. Imoinda begins as this, very pretty little girly princess who doesn't really know anything. And she's just a teenager. What do you expect her to know? But at the end, she is not only fighting against the slave owners, the slave traders, with Oroonoko side by side with him while pregnant. She is become heroic and militarized in her own right. But also, when Oroonoko concludes that he can't see the love of his life be captured and forced into slavery along with their unborn child, he resolves that, okay, I have to kill her before that happens because I can't witness it. He doesn't just sneak up behind her with a club and kill her himself when she's not looking. He goes to her and talks to her and explains it, and then she agrees. She exercises her own agency. She exercises her own power to decide, to say, yes, I think that's right. You should kill me. Think of the arc of that. Think about the capability where this giggling young girl at the beginning, she doesn't really giggle, but you know what I mean. This very young girl in the beginning who is so uncertain about everything, to the composure at the end, that heroic stand. Just like with Onahal, we see a figure of remarkable complexity. We see the capacities that women can endow, or be endowed with. So those little details get slipped in. Those little, oddities that, again, when you're skimming by, are really easy to miss. Those are the parts that matter. The simple plot descriptions don't really matter at all. I mean, once you get the idea, and it's fairly explicit, at one point they even call Oroonoko a martyr. Once you get past all of that, you can start to see why everything is being arranged the way it is, why those individual decisions are being made, those individual judgments are being made about not what the story is, but how the story is told. Those are the details that are most interesting, because they start to raise all these complications and raise all these considerations that, take some time to sort through. Is Oroonoko a representative of his people, the entire African population, or is he the exception to them? Is he the one good apple in a rotten barrel, or is he just one of them, and when he is saved at the end, or when he perishes at the end, but shows the dignity that he does that reflect on all of the enslaved Africans in Suriname? Or is it just, well, he's the good one? It's uncertain. The text is very vague on that point. And considering that, I think, opens up all new points of consideration, all new points of interpretation, points of debate, where we can comb through this in a very critical way and raise questions that do ultimately lead to a more perfect world, a more just world. Because it's only by considering these things from all these different angles that you can start to make a better world, an improved world. Stories like this and the art of the Enlightenment in general are trying to cast an eye on the acts or on the civilizations and societies and traditions that humanity has built for itself, separate from the moral component of God. The narrator here will invoke some moral questions sometimes, and reference pious Christian morality and all of that. But realistically, it is the novel, the story, and the art of the Enlightenment addresses itself to human actions and trying to decide whether or not they are just, whether or not they are moral, and in terms that we can understand. And by doing this, by pumping this kind of art into the ecosystem, the Enlightenment is creating individual perspectives. Remember that reliance on the reader thinking in very individualized terms. Decide for yourself, dear reader. Well, that is the same basic argument that founded this nation, among others. That individuals are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. That we have an individual set of rights, an individual set of judgments that we can make about society. And we as individuals are entitled to make them. And the only way society ultimately gets better or doesn't get worse is by exercising those rights, exercising that individuality, exercising that ability to cast your own critical eye on practically everything. Anything that has been presented to you and you've been told, all right, this is what this is how you do things, this is what we believe. It is incumbent upon us to say, well, let's think about that. Let's dig through that a little bit and just consider it for a second. Maybe I'll believe that. Maybe I'll continue that tradition. Maybe I'll take that up and celebrate it in my own life. But I'm going to think about it for a little while. I'm going to approach it from a number of different perspectives, from a number of different attitudes, to see if that's actually what I believe, if that's actually what is fair. And once you do that, you unleash enormous complication into the world. Because society is very simple in a totalitarian state, where the dear leader at the top says something and everybody else just falls in line. It's something else when every individual is empowered, where every individual feels under no obligation to follow any rules whatsoever set by somebody else. Now, you can make an argument for or against either of those positions, but the point is that by doing so, you are participating in the Enlightenment ideal of critical inquiry and the simple utilitarian belief in the credo of doubt everything. That's the Enlightenment.